All right, let's go. Number 10. Nataruk, Kenya. The oldest organized murder in the human record. In 2012, paleoanthropologist Marta Mirazon Lar of the Leverhulme Center for Human Evolutionary Studies at the University of Cambridge was surveying the exposed sediment flats west of Lake Turkana in northern Kenya. The site, called Nataruk, had been flagged as a Mesolithic habitation area based on surface scatters of worked obsidian and faunal remains. What her team found, preserved in a dry lake bed some 30 kilometers south of the Ethiopian border, would be published in Nature in January 2016 and would stand from that date forward as the oldest confirmed site of organized intergroup lethal violence in the human fossil record. 27 human skeletons lying in positions of sudden death. Dated to between 9,500 and 10,500 years ago, 10 of the 12 individuals, preserved well enough for trauma analysis, showed direct evidence of lethal force, blunt force skull fractures, cut marks on the cervical vertebrae, and in several cases obsidian projectile points embedded in cranial bone. One adult male lay with his hands in a position indicating his wrists had been bound before he died. A woman lay face down. She had been pregnant. The bones of her unborn child were found beneath her. 27 dead in a mobile hunter-gatherer band of 30 to 50 people. That is not a raid that caught a few at the margins. That is most of them gone in a single event, at a single location, from causes that left nothing ambiguous about what happened. But here's where the discovery dismantles a foundational assumption. For decades, the dominant academic model articulated most influentially by R. Brian Ferguson of Rutgers University held that organized warfare was a product of the Neolithic. You need surplus, the argument goes. You need territory worth defending. You need the social hierarchy capable of commanding violence at group scale. Mobile hunter-gatherers lack the structural preconditions for war. Nataruk predates agriculture by at least 3,000 years. The people who died there had no permanent settlements, no stored surplus, no territorial claims in any agricultural sense. And yet, someone bound at least 2 of them before killing them. Someone targeted a pregnant woman at projectile range. Multiple victims show evidence of close quarters finishing blows after being struck at distance. That sequence suppress, close eliminate, is not improvised chaos. It requires coordination, role differentiation, a shared objective communicated before arrival. The obsidian points found embedded in skulls are not hunting tools repurposed in a moment of rage. They are weapons of a type associated at this site and others with intergroup conflict. What Nataruk establishes is not that warfare is inevitable or instinctive. That would overstate what the bones allow. What it establishes with physical certainty is that the cognitive and social infrastructure for organized lethal violence, the planning, the bound captive, the coordinated attack on a group at range was fully present in our species long before the conditions that were supposed to create it existed. Not as a product of civilization, not as a response to agricultural pressure. It was already there. The people who came to the shore at Nataruk came for water or fish or shade. Whatever met them had organized itself before they arrived. Number 9. The Ofnet Cave, skull nests of Bavaria. The arrangement. In the summer of 1908, archaeologist Robert Rudolf Schmidt was conducting systematic excavations of a limestone cave in the Ries Basin of southern Bavaria, near the village of Ofnet. Local farmers had known the cave for years, occasionally turning up bone fragments they took for animal remains. Schmidt's excavation revealed something no existing framework could accommodate: 2 shallow pits dug deliberately into the cave floor a few meters apart, each filled with human skulls. 38 skulls, in total 27, in the larger pit, 9 in the smaller. Dated to around 6,500 BCE, placing them in the Mesolithic period before farming cultures arrived from the southeast. The skulls had been arranged with care, many oriented to face west and dusted with red ochre. perforated red deer teeth and freshwater shell ornaments were placed with the majority of them. Analysis by Wolfgang Henke of the University of Mainz and Nicholas Conard of the University of Tübingen confirmed the demographics: 27 skulls from children, 9 from women, 2 from adult men. Every single one showed perimortem blunt force trauma. Every single one had been separated from the body cut marks on the neck. Vertebrae are indicative of stone tool decapitation. These individuals were killed by blows to the head, then decapitated. Then their skulls were cleaned, arranged in prepared pits, and covered with ochre and ornament. 27 children in a single pit. If this was one event, and the stratigraphy supports that reading, then an entire community lost nearly all of its youngest generation at once. What makes the Ofnet arrangement most disturbing is not the violence itself. It is the ceremony that followed it. Whoever created these pits did not treat the skulls as discarded spoil. The ochre is not incidental. The deer teeth are not accidental. This is deliberate attentive ritual applied to skulls acquired through deliberate attentive killing. Both acts required time. Both required decision. The two dominant interpretations are war trophy collection, enemy heads, preserved to commemorate a military victory, and ancestor veneration, beloved dead, kept in reliquary proximity to the living. Each has precedence in later cultures. Neither accommodates the demographics. War trophies are predominantly adult males. 27 children are not war trophies in any sense the ethnographic record prepares us for. And if these are beloved, dead honored in death, they are not typically killed with clubs and decapitated first. What Nicholas Conard's published analyses acknowledge is the absence of a clean synthesis. The Ofnet pits suggest a relationship to the skulls of the violently dead that we have no adequate language for. A cosmology in which the skulls of killed children were worth preserving, worth decorating, worth positioning with attention, a logic organized enough to produce this arrangement, and lost entirely with the people who created it. The skull of a child packed with ochre and decorated with deer teeth placed in a pit in Bavaria 8,500 years ago. Someone decorated it who understood exactly why. That understanding is gone. The skull is not. Number 8. The Canaljorden skull site of Sweden. The display in the water. In 2009, archaeologists from the Swedish Cultural Heritage Foundation, Stiftelsen Kulturmiljövård, were excavating a drained Mesolithic lake near Motala in Östergötland County as part of a road construction project. The site, designated Canaljorden, had been identified as a Mesolithic habitation area through prior surveys. When the lake sediment was cleared from a preserved wooden platform structure buried under roughly 5 meters of accumulated lakebed material, what emerged was an assemblage that Anna Kjellström of Stockholm University would describe in a 2016 paper in Antiquity as having no parallel in Mesolithic European archaeology. 11 human skulls and fragments indicating at least one additional individual, all dated to around 5,500 BCE. Hunter-gatherer Sweden, 3,000 years before agriculture arrived in Scandinavia. The platform had been constructed from wooden stakes driven into the lakebed, a structure requiring sustained labor to build and maintain. Inside 2 of the recovered skulls, the team found what had mounted them: wooden posts driven through the base of the cranial vault into the interior, long enough, given the shallow water environment, to have held the skulls upright and visible above the surface. These skulls had been placed on stakes in a lake visible from the surrounding shoreline. Not buried, not concealed, not disposed of, displayed. The cranial trauma was present across multiple individuals, blunt force perimortem fractures indicating lethal violence. These were not people who died peacefully and were later honored with posthumous display. They were killed, and their heads were mounted. Here's where the discovery becomes genuinely disturbing beyond what the basic facts convey. Carbon dating of the platform's structural elements indicates it was maintained and returned to across multiple visits over time. The site also yielded bear skulls alongside the human material, a detail that Kjellstrom noted as consistent with shamanic traditions in which human and animal dead occupy equivalent positions in a shared cosmological order. Scandinavian prehistoric cosmology, inferred carefully from much later sources, treats bodies of water as thresholds between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond it. If the people who built Canaljorden understood the lake as a liminal boundary, a threshold through which things could be sent, then the skulls on stakes occupied the edge of the known world, visible to the living on shore, facing whatever received the dead below. That reading, however plausible, does not make the violence that preceded the display interpretable away. Someone killed these people. Someone mounted their skulls in water and built a structure to keep them there. The meaning assigned to the intersection of those two acts is partially recoverable. The violence is not. The lake was drained for road construction 7,500 years after the platform was built. The skulls were still there, still in position. Whatever the display was intended to communicate, whoever built it intended it to last. Number 7. Herxheim, Germany. The institution. In 1996, construction workers breaking ground for residential development in the village of Herxheim in Rhineland, Palatinate, southwestern Germany, encountered an unusual concentration of bone fragments embedded in ceramic-rich soil. The material matched the linear pottery culture, the first farming civilization of Central Europe active, from roughly 5,500 to 4,900 BCE, and archaeologist Andrea Zeeb-Lanz of the Rhineland-Palatinate State Office for Monument Care and Cultural Heritage secured an emergency excavation permit. What began as salvage work became, over the following decade, a body of analysis that Zeeb-Lanz and French bioarchaeologist Bruno Boulestin of the University of Bordeaux published in Antiquity in 2009 and in a detailed research monograph in 2011. What the Herxheim ditches contained was not evidence of a massacre. It was evidence of something with the architecture of an institution. The site consisted of two concentric oval ditches, a configuration characteristic of LBK ritual enclosures, covering around 3 hectares. The bone material in those ditches represented a minimum of 500 individuals, with the actual count possibly approaching 1,000, given the fragmentary and commingled state of the assemblage. Dated to the final phase of the LBK, roughly 5,300 to 4,950 BCE. The processing was thorough and specific. Skulls had been opened, and the calvarium, the dome of the skull, removed and shaped into skull cups, bowls fashioned from the top of a human head. Long bones had been split longitudinally for marrow. Defleshing cut marks ran across the assemblage in the same anatomical positions, using the same stone tool techniques applied to cattle and deer bones at every other LBK site across Central Europe. Boulestin's team concluded in the 2009 Antiquity paper that the modification patterns indicated nutritive cannibalism, not symbolic, not ritual defleshing for secondary burial, consumption. The alternative interpretation, mortuary defleshing bodies, cleaned as part of burial preparation, is advocated by some researchers. The difficulty with it is marrow extraction. Splitting long bones to access their interior fat and protein serves no mortuary purpose. In every faunal context where it appears, it indicates food processing. Its presence on the human bones at Herxheim is not ambiguous about function. Over a minimum of 50 years, possibly 150, 3 to 10 people per year killed and processed at a single fixed location. Not an event, a calendar. But here's where the evidence forces a complete revision of every straightforward explanation. The strontium isotope ratios encoded permanently in tooth enamel from the water and soil of a person's childhood showed that a substantial portion of the people processed at Herxheim were not local. They had come from 50 to more than 500 kilometers away, from across a range equivalent to crossing half of modern Germany. Not a single cohort either. The isotopic diversity covers a span consistent with multiple generations of arrivals from multiple regions. People were traveling to Herxheim from half a continent away over the course of generations. A massacre of local people, even a sustained and repeated one, fits within frameworks of raiding and territorial violence. A site to which people traveled 500 kilometers across multiple generations, where they were then killed and processed in a ritualized manner that is not a battlefield aftermath. That is a destination. The LBK culture collapsed across Central Europe around 4900 BCE, suddenly with evidence of widespread social breakdown and violence across its entire geographic range. Herxheim was operating in the decades immediately before that collapse. Whether the practices conducted there were symptom or accelerant, the record does not say. The skull cups from Herxheim were carefully finished. The bone surfaces show grinding along the edges. Someone made them functional. Whatever was consumed from them was consumed in a place that people traveled hundreds of kilometers to reach for generations, in a cultural context we have almost entirely lost. Whatever drove them there, some of them came willingly. Possibly all of them did. That possibility does not resolve. Number 6. Crow Creek, South Dakota. What was left in the trench? In 1978, archaeologist P. Willey of California State University at Chico was conducting federally mandated salvage excavations at a site on the Missouri River in central South Dakota, work required before rising reservoir waters submerged the area. The site, designated 39BF11 and known in the literature as Crow Creek, had been occupied by a community of the initial coalescent tradition, a maize farming culture whose villages occupied the Missouri River system from roughly 1250 to 1400 CE. Under the topsoil, Willey's team found the edge of a large trench. As the excavation expanded, the count of what was inside it grew. Willey documented his findings in the 1990 monograph Prehistoric Warfare on the Great Plains published by Garland. The trench contained the skeletal remains of 486 individuals, all deposited at roughly the same time, all from the same event, dated to around 1325 CE. It remains the largest mass grave in the pre-contact archaeological record of North America. The osteological analysis left little room for interpretation. 90% of the individuals showed cut marks indicating scalping surgical removal of the scalp from the skull applied to men, women, children, and the elderly alike. The cervical vertebrae of many showed cuts indicating decapitation. Long bones were fractured. Hands and feet had been removed from multiple individuals. Cut marks on the inferior surfaces of the mandibles indicated tongue excision. The pubic bones of adult males showed cut marks indicating the removal of the genitalia. Each of those findings required specific effort applied to specific anatomy for a purpose. 486 people, an estimated 60 to 70% of the community's total population. The young adult females are not in the trench, not dead elsewhere at the site, simply absent, taken. What makes this particularly unsettling is not the injury count, but what the injuries reveal about how the killing was conducted. The processing of 486 bodies, the scalping, the decapitation, the removal of extremities does not reflect rage. Rage exhausts. Rage ends. What was done at Crow Creek required sustained methodical effort applied to hundreds of bodies in sequence over hours or days. Whoever did this remained at the site, moving through the dead, one by one, not in a frenzy. Working. The climate context is inseparable from the event. Paleoclimatologist Scott Stein of California State University East Bay, analyzing tree ring chronologies and lake sediment cores from across the Great Plains, established that the period from roughly 1275 to 1350 CE was among the most severe drought intervals of the past 2,000 years in the region. Bison populations contracted sharply. The agricultural margins that Missouri River farming cultures had pushed northward for a century collapsed. Multiple populations competing for diminishing resources with no overarching authority to adjudicate competing claims. Anthropologist David Bamforth of the University of Colorado at Boulder characterizes Crow Creek not as a raid or a battle, but as an annihilation event, the near-complete elimination of a community. The bodies were eventually collected and placed in the trench by survivors who returned, or by neighboring peoples. The carnivore gnaw marks on the bones indicate they lay exposed for weeks before burial. Someone came back for 486 mutilated, partially consumed bodies and put them in the ground. There is a question Crow Creek raises that no excavation can answer: whether anyone ran, whether any of those 486 people tried to flee or hide or bargain. The bones cannot tell us that. They can only tell us that whatever they did, it did not work. Number 5. Schöneck-Kilianstädten, Germany. What was done to immobilize them? In 2006, construction work for a natural gas pipeline near the town of Schöneck-Kilianstädten in the German state of Hesse exposed a series of linear pottery culture features that archaeologists quickly identified as a massacre site. The excavation, led by Christian Meyer of the University of Mainz, proceeded over multiple field seasons and produced findings that Meyer and colleagues, including molecular biologist Joachim Berger of the Johannes Gutenberg University of Mainz and anthropologist Kurt W. Alt, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in August 2015. The paper received scholarly attention and almost no public notice. What it described warranted more. The pit held the remains of 26 individuals, dated to around 5000 BCE. All 26 had died violently. Skull fractures, perimortem tooth fractures from blows to the face, cut marks on the cervical vertebrae indicating decapitation. The demographic profile matched the established pattern at LBK massacre sites: adult males, predominant among the dead adolescent, and young adult females entirely absent, taken in the recurring pattern of LBK intergroup violence rather than killed. 7 children were in the pit. Several were infants. 26 people, every adult with both lower legs deliberately fractured, and 7 children whose bones show no such prior treatment, because unlike the adults, they did not need to be stopped from running. But what distinguishes Schöneck-Kilianstädten from every other LBK massacre site was precisely that fracture pattern. The tibiae, the shin bones, and in many cases, the fibulae, had been broken perimortem, not fractured in the chaos of the attack itself, where trauma tends to be irregular and associated with primary combat injuries. Not broken by soil compression over millennia, which produces taphonomic patterns forensic anthropology can distinguish from perimortem events. The fractures at Schöneck-Kilianstädten were deliberate, applied to both legs of nearly every adult in the pit, with force patterns indicating targeted blows to the lower limbs using heavy implements. Breaking the tibiae prevents walking, prevents running. The adults in that pit had their shin bones broken before or at the moment of death in a pattern applied to every adult in the assemblage without exception. In at least several individuals, the injury sequence indicates they were alive with fractured lower legs when the lethal blows were administered. Here's where the evidence demands the question that the forensic language of the published paper carefully avoids. Why? Why, in the course of killing 26 people, does it serve any practical purpose to break everyone's legs first? Immobilization during killing is efficient, yes, but applied to an entire assemblage, with thoroughness across every adult, the pattern points past tactical efficiency towards something else entirely. This looks like a rule, a decision made before the attack about how it would be conducted. Christian Meyer and colleagues noted in the 2015 paper that Schöneck-Kilianstädten, combined with the evidence from Talheim and Aspern-Schletz, establishes intergroup violence as structurally embedded in LBK culture, not peripheral to it, not an anomaly, but a recurring feature of the same society that built Central Europe's first permanent farming villages, developed sophisticated ceramics across a 1,000-kilometer geographic range, and established the agricultural communities that would shape the continent's trajectory for millennia. The violence and the civilization were not in opposition. They were the same project, the same mind, the same morning, two different procedures for two different ages. Number 4. The Koshice Massacre, Poland. The family in the soil. In 2011, agricultural work near the village of Koshice in the Małopolska region of southern Poland uncovered a mass grave. The skeletal remains were identified as Neolithic, belonging to the globular amphora culture, dated to around 2880 BCE, roughly contemporary, with the earliest phases of Stonehenge. The site was excavated by a team including Piotr Włodarczak of the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnology of the Polish Academy of Sciences. But the discovery that transformed Koshice from a well-documented massacre site into something more precisely devastating came from the molecular laboratory of Wolfgang Hack at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. The findings were published in 2017 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The pit held 15 individuals, 7 adults, and 8 children. All 15 had been killed by blows to the head injuries matching antler-headed clubs, or comparable blunt weapons delivered from behind or above. The bodies had been arranged with deliberateness in the pit. Adults positioned near children. The overall deposition suggesting that care had been taken in their placement. This was not chaotic disposal. Someone organized 15 bodies in the earth with a degree of attention that is unsettling only because of what preceded it. The ancient DNA analysis from Hack's laboratory did something the bones alone could not do. It identified who these 15 people were to each other. A single extended family. 3 generations, grandparents, parents, children, cousins. The maternal genetic line ran through all 3 generations. The adult men in the pit showed isotopic signatures, indicating they were not born locally. They had married into the community from other regions. The women and children were local. The family structure was multi-generational and entirely recognizable, a household of mothers and their children and grandchildren with fathers and uncles who had arrived from elsewhere and built their lives here. Every member of that household was killed and buried in a single pit. But here's where the DNA reveals something more disturbing than the deaths themselves. The genetic relationships among the 15 dead, when fully reconstructed, showed a demographic gap. The family as it existed at Koshice should have included young adult women, daughters of the older generation, sisters of some of the children, women of reproductive age, whose genetic signatures would be expected in a multi-generational household. They are not in the pit. Not dead elsewhere at the site, simply absent. Hack and colleagues were explicit about this in the 2017 paper. The demographic profile at Koshice matches the pattern at LBK massacre sites at Crow Creek and at other prehistoric violence assemblages spanning thousands of years and multiple continents. Young women of reproductive age are consistently absent from the dead. Repeated across sites separated by millennia and oceans, this is not coincidence. It is a practice. The women taken from Koshice were somewhere else within days of the massacre. They raised children who never knew their mothers' names for the river near where they were born. They lived out their lives in a community that had killed their family in a language that may or may not have been their own. Their descendants are recoverable in principle from skeletal assemblages in the surrounding region. We do not know where they went. We know only what was left behind. The family in the pit was arranged with care by the attackers or by survivors who returned. Both possibilities change the character of the act. If the attackers, they killed 15 people and then spent time placing them in the earth with attention. If survivors, someone came back to find a family dead and put them in the ground with what care was still available. In neither case is the care a comfort. It is simply what was done. The DNA of a grandmother and the grandchild buried beside her are distinct molecular signatures recoverable after 5,000 years. We know at a resolution unimaginable a generation ago that this child and this woman were family, that the man buried nearby was her father, that the woman on the other side was her mother's mother. We know exactly this. We know nothing else about them. Knowing what we know makes not knowing the rest harder, not easier. Number 3, Teviac and Schöneck Brittany, the Long War. The small island of Teviac sits a few kilometers off the southern coast of Brittany, France, in the cold gray waters of the Bay of Biscay. In 1928, archaeologists Marcel and Saint-Just-Pécard began excavating a Mesolithic shell midden in accumulated coastal refuse deposit built up over centuries on the island's surface. Beneath the shells and fish bones, they found a cemetery, 10 graves containing 23 individuals, dated through subsequent radiocarbon analysis to between roughly 6,400 and 5,500 BCE. The Pécards later excavated a comparable site on the nearby island of Schöneck, recovering 8 graves with 14 additional individuals. The assemblage has been reanalyzed repeatedly. The most thorough modern trauma study was conducted by Rick Schulting of the University of Oxford and Michael Wysocki, published in the Cambridge Archaeological Journal in 2002. Of the 37 individuals across both sites, between 30 and 40% had died of injuries indicating interpersonal violence, embedded stone projectile points, depressed cranial fractures from blunt weapons, perimortem cut marks indicating scalping, and the element that separates Teviac and Schöneck from a massacre site healed injuries. Multiple individuals had survived violent encounters recovered and been attacked again. One individual had both a healed cranial fracture and a fresh one. The violence at Teviac and Schöneck was not a single event. It was a condition that persisted across the lives of multiple generations on a cold island off the Atlantic coast. Schulting in the 2002 paper and in subsequent surveys of Mesolithic skeletal trauma found comparable rates of violent death ranging from 10 to 40% of examined individuals at sites from Portugal to Scandinavia. The people of Teviac were not anomalous. They were representative of a pattern running the entire length of Atlantic Europe. 30 to 40% of a population dying of violence over the course of a century is not a crime wave, not a war. It is the baseline mortality profile of a society in which killing between groups has become ordinary enough to constitute a leading cause of death. 3 or 4 people in every 10 over 100 years. Not occasionally, regularly. Here's where the discovery challenges something more fundamental than a casualty statistic. The same people who died with projectile points in their skulls were buried with extraordinary care. Antler headdresses were placed on their heads, intricate objects requiring real craft skill to produce. Red ochre was applied. Shell ornaments decorated the graves. One burial contained 2 individuals arranged with apparent deliberate association, their grave goods suggesting status and mourning in equal measure. These people were mourned by people who loved them, who invested creative and material resources in honoring their dead. They had names, they had relationships, they had a cosmology that required ceremony at the boundary between the living and the dead. And then, a generation later, someone in the same community died the same way. Lawrence Keeley of the University of Illinois at Chicago, whose 1996 book, War Before Civilization, compiled trauma data from prehistoric sites, globally argued that the archaeological evidence for endemic prehistoric violence had been underweighted by a field predisposed for ideological reasons to minimize it. The subsequent 3 decades of evidence, Nataruk Teviac, the LBK massacre sites, the Crow Creek Trench, has made the previous position difficult to hold. Agriculture did not introduce violence into the human world. It inherited one. The antler headdresses at Teviac are beautifully made. Someone had both the skill to fashion them and the care to place them on the heads of the people they buried. According to the trauma record, some of the people who made those headdresses died with fractures in their own skulls. The culture that produced the care and the culture that produced the violence were not in opposition. They were the same people on the same island doing both things for centuries. Number 2, the Tollense Valley, Germany, the scale of what was organized. In 1996, a single human arm bone was recovered from the river sediment of the Tollense River in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, in the flat lake-scattered landscape of northern Germany, near the small town of Velzen. A flint arrowhead was lodged inside it. The find was reported to Detlef Janssen of the State Office for Culture and Monument Preservation of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, who recognized its significance and secured an initial excavation permit. Over the following decade, and then with substantially expanded scope under a major project led by Thomas Terberger of the Georg August Universität Göttingen, beginning around 2007, the Tollense River Valley yielded something that had never been identified in European prehistory, a Bronze Age battlefield. The sediment and surrounding floodplain have so far produced the skeletal remains of a minimum of 140 individuals, all dated by radiocarbon and artifact association to around 1250 BCE. 85 to 90% are male. The age distribution runs predominantly from 20 to 40 years. The injuries indicate combat at close range and at distance bronze swords, wooden clubs, flint, and bronze arrowheads. One individual had been struck by 5 arrows. Several skulls show multiple blunt force fractures, indicating continued assault after the first blow. The weapons recovered bronze spearheads, standardized arrowheads, a distinctive bronze tube that may have served as a personal identifier, represent military investment that does not accumulate in village-scale societies. 140 identified individuals is almost certainly a severe undercount. Terberger and colleagues, publishing in Antiquity and in Quaternary International, estimated from the density of finds across the surveyed area that the total number of combatants at the Tollense engagement may have been between 2,000 and 4,000. Only 10 to 15% of the site has been excavated. The battlefield may extend for 3 kilometers along the river. 2 to 4,000 men fighting in a river valley in northern Germany in 1250 BCE, a century before the earliest estimates for the Trojan War. 2 centuries before the traditional dating of the Bronze Age collapse. This is not the margins of prehistoric Europe. This is its center, producing armed engagements at a scale that implies military organization the field had not until Tollense needed to account for. But here's where conventional archaeology finds itself without adequate categories. The strontium and oxygen isotope ratios in the tooth enamel of the Tollense dead, analyzed by Joachim Berger's team at Johannes Gutenberg University, showed that these men did not come from the local region. Some had northern German signatures. Others showed values matching origin in the Alpine region, hundreds of kilometers south. Others indicated origins in southern or eastern Europe. Multiple distinct regional populations gathered at a river in northern Germany with a shared military purpose. That is not a border dispute between neighboring villages. Coordinating the movement of 2,000 to 4,000 men from multiple regions of Europe to a single location requires supply chains. Communication networks operating across hundreds of kilometers, a shared command structure, and a degree of political integration across what had been assumed to be a fragmented landscape of loosely connected communities. Terberger has described Tollense as evidence that the Bronze Age European world was substantially more organized and militarized than existing frameworks had been built to accommodate. What Tollense implies when absorbed fully is that the infrastructure for war, the logistics, the standardized armament, the capacity to converge thousands of men from disparate regions at a fixed coordinate developed before the formal state structures we associate with military capacity. The first thing human beings organized at continental scale may not have been trade networks, may not have been religious pilgrimage, may have been this. The horse bones recovered at Tollense show injuries from being ridden into combat in a river environment. They had no understanding of why they were there. They were in that river because someone had made very careful plans. After the battle, the valley was avoided. Settlement patterns in the region show reduced occupation for centuries. There are places you do not return to. The Tollense Valley was one of them for a very long time. Number 1. The Yamnaya expansion, the world that was replaced to make ours. The tool that uncovered the greatest atrocity in prehistoric human history was not a trowel, not a ground-penetrating radar array, not a radiocarbon accelerator. It was a sequencing machine in a university genetics laboratory. Beginning in 2015 with a landmark paper in Nature by Wolfgang Hack of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, David Reich of Harvard Medical School, and their co-authors, including Josef Lazaridis and Nick Patterson, and continuing through Reich's 2018 synthesis paper in Nature, and the ongoing output of Eski Willerslev's group at the University of Copenhagen genome sequencing, performed a particular kind of excavation on European prehistory, not of objects, of people, of the people who were there and then were not. The Ancient DNA Project has now sequenced the genomes of more than 10,000 prehistoric individuals across Europe and Central Asia, covering a span from roughly 40,000 BCE to around 1000 BCE. The pattern that emerged from that data has been replicated across multiple independent research groups on multiple continents. It is not contested within the field. It is simply not widely known outside it. Beginning around 3000 BCE, a population from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the broad grasslands north of the Black Sea, and the Caspian Sea, in what is now Ukraine, southern Russia, and Kazakhstan, began expanding westward into Europe and southward into South Asia. This population is known in the archaeological record as the Yamnaya, named for their distinctive burial mounds kurgans, which mark the steppe landscape from Romania to Central Asia. They herded cattle, kept horses, and were among the first populations to ride them, which gave them a range and tactical mobility that settled agricultural communities could not match. They also carried, according to ancient pathogen analysis, published by Willerslev's group in Cell in 2015, early strains of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the Black Death, a novel pathogen for which the European farming populations they encountered had no prior immune exposure. In Britain, the ancient DNA data is stark to the point of being difficult to process. Reich and colleagues comparing the genetic ancestry of individuals from before 2500 BCE, the megalith builders whose farming lineage had been continuous in Britain since roughly 4000 BCE, with individuals from after 2450 BCE found that the genetic heritage of the British population had been replaced at approximately 90% within 2 to 3 centuries. Not 2 to 3 millennia. Not a long demographic transition across many generations. 2 to 3 centuries. 4 or 5 human lifetimes. The people who built Stonehenge, who had maintained genetic continuity with their agricultural ancestors for 1500 years, were reduced to a trace signal below 10% in the British gene pool. Not reduced, not diluted, not partially absorbed into a new culture, reduced to a residue. Similar replacement patterns at rates between 60 and 95% have been confirmed across Germany, France, Iberia, Scandinavia, and the Netherlands. Not a British anomaly, continental. If the Yamnaya had turned south rather than west, if the plague had burned itself out on the steppe before reaching the European agricultural frontier, if the horses had not given their riders the capacity to cover the distances, they covered the language you speak the DNA in your cells. The entire cultural inheritance of every civilization between the Atlantic and the Urals would have developed from a different population entirely. The megalith builders would have continued. Their knowledge of the solstice, their language, their names for the dead, none of it would be lost. But the Yamnaya moved west, the horses were fast, and the plague moved faster. But here's where the evidence collides with a question the genetics alone cannot answer: what actually happened? The ancient DNA documents replacement. It does not document method. David Reich, in his 2018 book, Who We Are and How We Got Here, and in subsequent academic discussion, has been careful to note that replacement could theoretically occur through differential reproductive success, through disease-driven depopulation, or through male-mediated migration patterns. These are honest scientific qualifications. They are also, when measured against the full record, inadequate as complete explanations. Differential reproductive success cannot account for 90% replacement in 2 to 3 centuries, unless the reproductive advantage is so extreme as to be functionally indistinguishable from the elimination of the prior population's reproductive capacity. Disease-driven depopulation creates demographic vacuums, but does not explain near-total replacement of one ancestry by another, rather than the genetic mixing we would expect if dying communities were simply being replaced by incoming arrivals. And the archaeological record of the period is not consistent with a peaceful demographic transition. The monument-building traditions stop. Construction programs that had defined European farmer culture for millennia simply cease. Population levels in the material record drop sharply before the new ancestry signal arrives. The megalithic enclosures are abandoned. The communal tomb traditions end. Wolfgang Hack has described the scale of the European population transition as without parallel in any documented historical event, exceeding in geographic scope and speed the demographic impact of the later European colonization of the Americas on indigenous populations. Not disrupted, not gradually transformed, gone. The people who were replaced had built extraordinary things. The passage grave at Newgrange in Ireland was constructed around 3200 BCE. This is older than Stonehenge, older than the Great Pyramid of Giza by 600 years, older than the first alphabet by more than 2,000 years, older than Rome by 3,000 years. It is aligned to the winter solstice sunrise, with a precision requiring both the mathematical capacity to calculate the exact solar angle and the engineering capacity to construct a corbelled stone chamber without metal tools, without wheeled transport, with a purpose-built light box above the entrance that admits a single beam of sunlight once a year for 17 minutes at dawn on the shortest day. The triple spiral carvings at Newgrange are among the most technically accomplished decorative work in Neolithic Europe. Their geometric precision remains without entirely satisfying explanation. These were not primitive people. They were sophisticated in ways we are still working to understand, doing things we still cannot fully account for. Whatever cognitive and organizational capacity produced Newgrange, it was fully present in northwestern Europe 6,000 years ago, and then it was gone. The genetic descendants of the people who built Newgrange constitute less than 10% of the modern Irish population. The people who completed the later phases of Stonehenge were predominantly descended from the population that had replaced Stonehenge's original builders. A new people finishing the stones of a monument they had inherited by replacing those who laid the first course. We do not know the language of the megalith builders. Not a word, not a name, not a number. We do not know what they called the solstice light that entered the Newgrange chamber, or what they understood it to mean, or what they told their children about it. We do not know their stories, their prayers, their names for the rivers and the hills beneath which they built their monuments. All of it, every thought, every word, every way of understanding the sky and the dead and the turning of the year is gone. Not mostly gone, not preserved in fragments recoverable by future scholarship. Gone with the people who held it in 2 or 3 centuries, sometime around 2500 BCE. If you have European ancestry, the majority of the DNA in your body comes from a lineage that arrived on horseback from the Pontic steppe around 3000 BCE, whose arrival coincided with the near erasure of the people who had been watching the solstice at Newgrange for 1500 years before them. Not marginally. Predominantly, the people who came before are present in your genome at a frequency below 10% a whisper beneath the noise of everything that replaced them. You carry them the way a palimpsest carries the text scraped off to make room for the writing that came after not readable, not recoverable as language or story or name, but present as a density in the material beneath the legible surface. Their trace is measurable as a statistical frequency. It is not recoverable as anything else. Newgrange still stands. The chamber still fills with solstice light once a year for 17 minutes, as it has for 5,000 years. The spirals are exactly what they were, when the hands that carved them were alive. The people who carved them are present in the Irish genome at a level below 10% in bones that will never tell us their name. They are the ghost in the genome, the faint signal beneath the noise. You carry them. You cannot hear them. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.